All right, welcome back to the listener's commentary on the Gospel of Luke. In this session, we are going to be looking at Luke chapter 9, verses 18 and following. And just to make sure we have the big picture in mind, keep in mind that Luke has an initial section that's the beginning of Luke from 1:1 all the way up through the middle of chapter 4 that really we just called kind of like the beginnings. The story begins, and it's the birth of John the Baptist and Jesus and all of that. And then he has this first large section about Jesus' ministry that goes from the middle of chapter 4 through 9:50. And we're approaching the end of that. And so Luke is focusing our attention really here in chapter 9 on Jesus' interaction with the disciples, because in the next major section from 9:51 all the way up through 19, there's going to be an increasing emphasis on preparing the disciples for what's going to happen in Jerusalem and for the ministry they're going to assume when Jesus ascends. And so Luke is really beginning to transition to Jesus' focus on the disciples. And here in this particular section, Luke 9:18 and following, we just need to keep the context in mind. At this point, Jesus' ministry is growing and expanding. And as a result of that, rumors about him are swirling through the towns and villages of Galilee. People are beginning to wonder, could this be? Like, maybe the time is really being fulfilled. And the Jews of this day are operating with great anticipation, anyhow, great longing in their heart for God to really write the final chapters of their story. That's sort of the way they see it. Like, they recognize they're still under foreign oppression. Their exile in one sense is ended, but in another sense is not. And so there's all this angst and this longing and this sense of, where is God in the midst of this, and when is he going to show up? And well, now here's Jesus on the scene. And so rumors are swirling, and hopes are being stirred, and people have their opinions about him. And one of the things that has become obvious from chapter 4 through this point is Luke is wanting us to wrestle with the question, who is Jesus? Who is Jesus? Well, here in Luke 9:18 and following, now we really begin to focus on that question in force as we prepare for what that's going to mean for him. And so Jesus actually comes out and asks his disciples who they think he is. And that's the focus of this little bit here in Luke chapter 9, verses 18 and following. So picking up in Luke 9:18, it reads like this: "And it happened while he was praying alone." And so Jesus is withdrawn from the crowds. It's just him and the 12 and maybe a handful of other disciples, a smaller group of sort of his inner circle of disciples. And he's off spending some time in prayer by himself, which is one of the distinctives of Luke. He emphasizes Jesus' prayer life and at least points out regularly how Jesus frequently spent time in prayer. So Jesus is off praying alone. The disciples are near to him, and they come to him, and he questioned them, saying, "Who do people say that I am?" So what are you hearing as you listen to the people in the towns and places where we go? And they answered and they said, "John the Baptist, and others say Elijah, but others say one of the prophets of old has arisen." And if you recall, we saw this exact same kind of situation, this exact same line in chapter 9, verses 7 and 8, where Herod was wondering who Jesus is, and he was perplexed because he's hearing the rumors of the people too, and they're saying the exact same thing, 9, 7, and 8, right? With Herod, that it's John the Baptist or Elijah or one of the prophets. So the disciples, that's what they're hearing as well. They're hearing these same sort of rumors about Jesus, and Jesus said to them, "What about you? Who do you say that I am?" And Peter answered and said, "The Christ of God." The word Christ is the Greek equivalent for the Hebrew Messiah, Mashiach. And it means anointed one, God's anointed. To be anointed particularly as king. The idea of Messiah or Christ really, in fact, that word was not the most common word for the coming one that the Jews were looking forward to. But as a title, it captured this idea of the son of David, the one who's going to sit on David's throne, the one who's going to culminate all God's plans and promises for the Jews. And so when Peter says, we think you're the Messiah, we think you're the anointed one of God, that's what they're expecting, right? Like, you're the great coming one who had been promised long ago and who we've been looking for and waiting for and praying for and watching for. And for them, what picture came to mind? Well, the picture that came to mind for them when they thought of the Messiah, the son of David, the promised one, when they looked forward to that, they pictured someone who would be a great king and make them into a great nation again, and vanquish all their enemies and conquer the Romans in their particular case, and all those Gentile nations that had subverted them, that they would put them in their place and they would elevate and establish Israel as the greatest nation on earth. And that's what they looked forward to. And kind of along with that, they expected then that God would make all things new, and that there would enter into this great golden age in which all the promises of the prophets would come to pass, and there would be peace and harmony, and everything good would come again. That's what they're looking forward to. And so when they say the Christ of God, the picture they're picturing is this great and mighty king who would do all of these things for them. Jesus agrees that he is the Messiah. He's going to affirm that for them, but he has a very different picture of what that means. And so verse 21, but he warned them and instructed them, don't tell anyone. And part of the reason for that, though that seems odd for us, wouldn't he want them to know? Part of the reason for that is because their understanding of Messiah and his understanding of Messiah don't match. And he has more work to do, particularly preparing his disciples, and especially the apostles, the 12, preparing them for what lies ahead. And so it's not time. It's not ready for that word to get out. And so he has some things they need to understand before he's really ready for all the crowds to know that he's the Messiah, because they have their own image and they're going to try to force him to fit that picture. And so here's what he says. He warned them not to tell anyone. And then verse 22 saying, here's what he's saying to them. Look, the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders and chief priests and scribes and be killed and be raised on the third day. This is a completely different picture of Messiah than they had. And as a result, he's wanting them to keep things kind of under wraps until they can all begin to process this. He can help them understand what this means. He can prepare them for that. He doesn't want to be forced into, them trying to make him into a Messiah that he's not. And so, no, we're not. We need to keep things on the down low for now. And that's the reason why, is because he's a Messiah that's going to suffer, be rejected, be killed, and then be resurrected. Now, notice as a part of that, he shifts from the title Peter uses, the Christ of God, to this title, Son of Man. And the phrase Son of Man actually is, in the Gospels, all four of the Gospels, the most common way Jesus refers to himself, Son of Man. And that phrase is an Old Testament phrase that originally just meant a human being, the son of Adam, right? Like a human being. That's what originally it meant. But then it took on special force in the Old Testament in Daniel chapter 7, when Daniel sees one like a son of man who is given authority over all things on behalf of God, the Ancient of Days, and actually sits on the throne with the Ancient of Days and rules over God's kingdom. And so the Son of Man is just a human being, but in Daniel's vision, he's a human being with divine authority, with authority over all things. He's been given God-given authority. In fact, Chris Wright, in his book on knowing Jesus in the Old Testament, actually suggests the idea that he thinks perhaps Jesus chose the title Son of Man as the phrase to refer to himself, specifically because it didn't have all the baggage that Messiah had, or Son of David had, or some of the more common titles for the Messiah. It just hadn't been kind of caught up in popular imagination as a predominant messianic title, and thus Jesus could use it to refer to himself. Um, People could wonder exactly what he meant by that, and he could infuse it with more accurate content for who the Messiah was and what the Messiah was going to do, as he does here in verse 22. He's the Son of Man, and he's going to suffer, be rejected, be killed, and be raised on the third day. Now, not only that, but what Jesus goes on to say to his disciples is, that's what's going to happen to me, and my followers must imitate the exact same pattern. And so, verse 23, he was saying to them all, if anyone wants to come after me, he must deny himself, take up his cross daily, and follow me. Now, first of all, we got to keep several things in mind. The first is this: Jesus is saying this to them before he himself has been crucified. Just from our vantage point, we know the end of the story, right? We know how he's going to die. We know what that means. And so we also have all the theologizing of the New Testament letters on the cross. So we have all of that. But when he first says these words here in Luke 9:23, that hasn't happened yet. And so they don't understand all of that yet. They don't have the full story and the full picture yet. And so when he says, if anyone wants to come after me, he must deny himself, take up his cross daily, I have to imagine for them, they're like, wait, what? Hold on. I'm not getting it. Because they didn't have Jesus on the cross. They didn't know what that meant yet, right? All they knew is what a cross was. And what was a cross? Well, a cross was a horrific form of, really, as one scholar called it, state-sponsored terrorism. It was a Roman execution device that was used to really intimidate and almost cause terror to keep subjects, particularly in outlying provinces such as Judea, in line. And the Jews were familiar with this. Like, if the Jews rebelled and revolted against Rome, what could they expect? They could expect to have nails driven through their wrists and their ankles and hung on a cross until slowly they suffocated and died. So when Jesus says, if anyone wants to come after me, he must deny himself, take up his cross daily, and follow me, that's all the picture they have in mind. And we now know from our vantage point that to do that is actually to imitate Jesus, because we know the rest of the story, and they will too. They'll eventually know the rest of the story, but not yet. And when it says, if anyone wants to come after me, that means to be his disciple, to follow him. Here's what Jesus is saying. He's trying to help them realize that, okay, Peter, you got the answer right. Yes, I'm the Christ of God. I'm just not the kind of Messiah that you're expecting and you're thinking. And thus, to be my follower doesn't entail what you think it means. You think it means glory. You think it means greatness. You think it means, being part of my cabinet as I establish this great and glorious nation and my kingdom upon the earth. That's what you have in mind. But I'm going to suffer and die. And if you want to be part of my kingdom, you need to be willing to lay down your life as well. And that's what Jesus is saying here in verse 23. And so to be Jesus' disciple requires personal self-denial and a willingness to lay down our life for his sake and for his kingdom's sake if we want to follow him. Jesus goes on in verse 24 and kind of amplifies this a little bit. He gives a rationale really for this. He says, for whoever wants to save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake, this is the one who will save it. Notice the contrast between saving his life and losing his life and saving his life. When we try to get a life according to the wisdom and the goals and the values of this world, we actually lose our life. And Jesus can mean that in a variety of senses here for the original hearers of his words. In one sense, if they try to save their life, right, like get their life according to what they're expecting the Messiah to be, the picture that they have in mind for the Messiah, and how they're, we're going to overthrow the Romans and we're going to, set up a kingdom in Jerusalem. And if that's the picture they have in mind of how that's how we're going to get a life and how we're going to save our life, Jesus is like, no, it's not going to work. And he knows, and we'll hear him in towards the end of the Gospel of Luke. We'll hear him say, no, like there's actually doom coming for Jerusalem. There's actually destruction coming for Jerusalem because of that approach to things. And so if you're going to try to get a life and save your life according to the vision and values of even the culture around you, in their case, the Jewish culture around them, not going to work. You're going to actually lose your life. But if you will lose your life for my sake, this is the one who will save it. And so if you're willing to lay down your life for the sake of Jesus, if you're willing to adjust your perspective and your approach and your values and your ambitions for the sake of Jesus, then that's the person who's actually going to save their life, save their life both now and forever. Ironically, in Jesus' upside down kingdom, the way to save your life is actually to lose it. To say, okay, not my wisdom, not my approach, not my goals, not my values, not my ambitions, but Jesus' approach and Jesus' way of doing it. And Jesus' way is cross-shaped. It's a whole different approach to saving life and getting a life than what culture, whether their culture or our culture, tells us. Jesus goes on in verse 25 and says, for what good does it do a person if he gains the whole world but loses or forfeits himself? In other words, if you are trying to get a life and you get all these things, you gain the whole world, you get all this stuff, right? You get all these things, but in the long run, you actually lose or forfeit your own very self. And plenty of examples abound from history of people who had tons and yet are empty and wonder if this is all there is to life. And so there is more to life than just gaining stuff, gaining the whole world, and all that. So Jesus wants to help his disciples realize they have to have a different vision and a different picture of what life is all about and what life looks like. And he finishes this little section of kind of helping them rethink what it means to be the Messiah and what it means to be part of the Messiah's kingdom with these words in verse 26. He says, for whoever is ashamed of me and my words, the Son of Man will be ashamed of him when he comes in his glory and the glory of his Father and the holy angels. And so he's saying, look, if you're ashamed of me as a Messiah who's going to suffer and die, as a cross-carrying Messiah, suffering the shame of that, like that kind of Messiah, that kind of approach to defeating evil, that kind of approach to bringing in God's kingdom, that's lowly, that's weak, that doesn't make sense according to the vision and the values of the world, right? We know that from their day. We know that from our day. There's graffiti from Rome that mocks Christians for worshiping a donkey hanging on a cross. Like, to worship a crucified person, that's foolishness. And so if you're going to be ashamed of a suffering, dying, cross-carrying Messiah, Jesus says, I'll be ashamed of you when I come in my glory and the glory of my Father. It's like, no, there is glory coming. As Son of Man, like read Daniel 7, the Son of Man approaches the Ancient of Days and is given a kingdom over all things, all people, right? Like he is a king and there is glory to come. But the path to glory goes through lowliness and suffering. And so you need to choose that path. You need to walk that path if you want to be Jesus' disciples. Not to be ashamed of him and not to be ashamed of his lowly, humble, self-sacrificial, self-giving approach to giving life and forming his kingdom. That's the way of his kingdom. And Jesus says in verse 27, but I say to you truthfully there are actually some of those standing here who will not taste death until they see the kingdom of God. So even though Jesus is going to suffer and die, that does not negate his kingship, his bringing in of the kingdom of God. And not only that, it's actually going to happen soon. That's the point of verse 27. Like, yes, my way is different. Yes, me being the Messiah is going to look different than what you expect, but I'm still going to inaugurate God's kingdom. I'm still a king, and I'm going to bring that in. It's just going to be different, and it's going to happen soon, even during the lifetime of some of those standing there. Catch that. Like, truly, some of those standing here will not taste death. They're not going to die until they experience the kingdom of God. In fact, the kingdom of God is in their midst, Jesus says in Luke 17:21, like it's among you. And Peter, James, and John are about to get a glimpse of Jesus' glory in just a week from this moment. In the next story, Peter, James, and John get a glimpse of Jesus' very glory as king, and Jesus' death and resurrection, and then the consequent pouring out of the Spirit that Luke will describe in Acts chapter 2. Well, guess what? That then leads to Peter proclaiming Jesus is king. Peter proclaims that God has appointed him as King and Lord, Messiah and Lord, he says in Acts chapter 2. And so that moment in Acts 2 inaugurates the very kingdom of God in a new and powerful way. And so the kingdom of God is present among them, and it's going to come with power, but it's going to be expressed in this self-giving sort of way. It's going to be formed through the rejection, suffering, and dying, and then rising of the Messiah again. And so it's a different kind of kingdom, and he's a different kind of king. And so we, as his followers now, who have the whole story, we have something that took them a while to get and to see, but we have the whole story. And one of the things we need to make sure we hear, and as we listen to what Jesus says here, is okay, since we have the whole story, if we are going to be servants and ambassadors of this kind of king, if we're going to be disciples of this kind of king, then we need to live a cross-shaped life, a life that lays itself down for the sake of others, just like Jesus laid down his life for our sake. We need to be willing to let Jesus's vision and Jesus' values trump our vision and our values for life. We're going to lay down our life for the sake of others like Jesus laid down his life for us. We're going to lay down our life for the sake of Jesus and his kingdom, like Jesus laid down his life for us. And so Jesus is indeed the Son of Man. He is indeed the Messiah, but he's not the kind of Messiah they were expecting, and often not the kind of Messiah we would glorify. We like our heroes to be come in with guns a-blazing and take out the enemies, but Jesus has a different vision and a different set of values for how to defeat evil, and it's through the power of self-giving, self-sacrificial love.